Knucklebones, Chapter 15. He thought about it all day and all night, and in the end he decided the best thing for it was to cut the girl in half, vertically or horizontally. Perhaps he'd make himself a Nescafe first while he decided, savored the memory of the wet, its bits squeezed smooth through his fingers. It made a mess, but it was worth it. Mallory let the pleasure of morning sunshine wash over his broad, pale face. He sat at the antique drawing board he'd found in a skip in Ffrynt, back in the days when he still had a life. Though even before his illness he reckoned he'd always been a bit OCD. His main pastime after work in his family had consisted of A2 drawings he stippled on cartridge paper and extra fine black pen. Some of his old work still hung on the walls. Not the most cheerful pictures, he'd be the first to admit, but where the inspiration came from, he couldn't say. Then he'd been happy. Meeting Ruth, who'd been a temp worker at the bank. Having their daughter Alice, their lives together, had changed his own life, made it more precious than when his life was just his. Of course, Alice wasn't his by blood, but it's wrong that you can't love somebody who isn't blood as much as you would love your own. Even better, because they're not blood. The worst was when suspicion turned against him. Not long enough to garner attention, they never arrested him or charged him, and he wasn't mentioned in the papers. Still, it was agony. While Alice remained wary of him at first, didn't like sharing her mother with him, at the end, he gained her trust. They'd started to become friends. He still wasn't sure if it was this or the months of grief and stress that caused Ruth to leave him and return to her parents in Wythenshawe, though she gave him a flimsy excuse only a moron would believe. The drawing board, built perhaps in the late 19th century, was a real find. He knocked on the door of the house where he'd seen it in a skip and asked the owner if he could take the drawing board away. Offered him a bit of dosh, 30 quid, which the man, a pensioner, had waved away. "Oh, take the bloody thing. You'll do me a favor." Somehow he'd fitted it into his truck and driven it to Cheshire and brought it back to life in his sister's garage. That was when he still had the old Bangor, which didn't really suit his job at the bank. He'd still had Ruth and Alice, and of course, his health. Only 2 years ago when his feet were cut out from under him. To be almost precise, 1 year, 344 days, 85 hours, and 28 minutes. 2 years exactly at the fag end of this month, 23rd July, 2011, 9:28 p.m. A Saturday night, the worst night of the week. But it felt like 100 years ago. On the worst days, never. That life, with its ups and downs, its laughter and tears, had belonged to somebody else. Somebody who disappeared to never return. Almost 2 years ago. He should be healed by now, shouldn't he? Time heals, the motto said. A filthy lie. Back to the drawing board. The drawing board was made of teak and cast iron, with wires and pulleys and weights to adjust the slant of the board. Right now its board lay flat, with the ruler pushed to its top edge, cluttered with the various tools of what had become his trade. Knives, bin bags torn into sheets, masking and duct tape, plastic ties, wire, sometimes scissors, a hand saw, newspapers and hot water, a massive mason and cash bowl borrowed from his mother's house. Where the teak was visible, sunshine made it glow because he rubbed and polished the wood 3, sometimes 4 times a week. He loved wood, the fact that it lived, that it had patterns, that it could survive the worst neglect imaginable. Polishing the teak became his primary job when the pictures tattooed on his subconscious wouldn't come. Polishing, the repetitive circular movement, the once-alive grain of the wood, the subtle scent of lemon in the beeswax, all became part of a ritual that comforted him when memories burst the wall he'd erected, bringing agony. Of course, his real name wasn't Mallory. Reading the Morte d'Arthur in college as part of the English literature degree he started as a mature student but had to abandon 2 years ago, he was struck by the romance of the Round Table and its knights, and also the idea of Mallory's relation to the Welsh via the name Maelor. He decided to take the name of the author, who'd not traveled an easy road either, as his own, finalized by deed poll. The diminutive of his real first name in some foreign languages meant bad or sick. He'd given up that first name and used his surname when he had to. He was just Mallory. This way, he could try to blot out that other person whom tragedy split and gutted like a fish, who still could not go out. He sipped his Nescafe. He preferred filter espresso when he could afford it. Ruth had always loved lattes, not the powdered crap that came in a tin, but 2 espressos and 1/3 of a mug of hot milk. Strong coffee was one of the loves he'd kept from his former life. For now, he doubled the amount of coffee spooned in and drank it without milk. He'd given up milk and sugar because of the expense. Plus, it was one less item to buy in the small amount delivered weekly from the supermarket just a few meters from his house. It was funny, really, to fork out a £3 surcharge for delivery when it would cost nothing to walk there. Distance didn't matter. 1 meter or 500, it made no difference to him as he was now, unable to step into the space beyond the front door downstairs. He could manage the short trip to get his post off the mat as long as he did it after midnight, when everyone in the house was asleep. And Shop Fresh was always booked for the first or last slot of every Monday, so he could leave the front door on the latch with a note taped on it to remind residents, please not to lock it, for the poor delivery man to get inside and lug 2 boxes of groceries up 4 flights of stairs. His preferred delivery slot wasn't always available either, which meant the door would be on the latch for hours, but at least he was at home and could keep an eye on suspicious comings and goings. The doorbells for each flat were connected to an intercom, but since Alice's disappearance, he'd disconnected his, thus the need to leave the front door unlocked. And to think, in the time before 1 year, 344 days, 85 hours, and 44 minutes ago, he'd almost never been at home. Weekdays meant work, up at 7 a.m., home by 6. Evenings, he'd drive Alice to activities like swimming or riding lessons and the ballet she'd done since she was 6, or to friends for sleepovers. Ruth always said, now don't take advantage of your stepdad, though she and Mallory never married. But he didn't mind. It was time spent with Alice, and sometimes she'd tell him all about her. On Saturdays, they always tried to do something fun together out as a family, trips to the Museum of Science and Industry in Manchester, or Bolton Museums, one of which had a mummy and Nefertiti's bust, or to the Cineplex at Llandudno Junction, though Alice, at 12, had just started to be less interested in spending time with him and Ruth than with her mates. Sunday was the one day of the week they pulled up the drawbridge and stopped in. They even got Alice interested in Texas Hold'em, which they play in the afternoon. Then Mallory would go out for a chippy tea. How much it irritated him at the time that Ruth never wanted chips, just cod. But when he got the food back, it smelled so nice, of course she wanted some of his chips. Ruth's fingers would wander towards Alice's chips as well, evading like a crab, her daughter's wooden fork stabbing down. Alice didn't like to share either. Tiresome then. Now he would give his soul to be going out for cod and chips for the 3 of them, and Ruth would be welcome to nick whatever she wanted off his plate. The drawing board was positioned so that his seat was in the alcove, the light over his shoulder and onto the board. Every day he woke early and worked in natural daylight. Going to bed when it got dark saved even more money in electricity. The seat had also been in the skip, a piano stool that turned 360 degrees. While he thought a bit more about his latest project, he swiveled his seat so that he could look out on Sea Road. There was the new girl strolling down the road from the direction of Gwyntaw Castle, the hood on her pram down against the sun. She looked really nice, with her cloud of hair that exact copper hue worshipped in some Celtic traditions, surrounding a face he found pleasing without makeup. He'd watched from the alcove window last week as she moved into the first-floor flat with an older woman who might have been her mother. Maybe the mother wasn't a tenant, as he'd not seen her since. As if telepathic, the girl looked up at his window, smiled, and waved. The child in the pram waved too. He dodged back from the glass, his heart a solo on bongos. Before 1 year, 344 days, 85 hours, and 52 minutes ago, Ruth and he would have gone downstairs to welcome their new neighbor to the house and tell her, don't hesitate to knock if she needed tea, a cup of sugar, anything. These days he didn't have the sugar to loan. He got up the nerve to look out the window again. She and her child had disappeared under the eave. Almost immediately she emerged again, waved to someone else, probably that mad old coot who lived downstairs. Box, he called her, as in mad as a box of frogs. Box, he remembered from his going-out days, always stood in the bay window on the ground floor, staring out at a vision she alone could see. Mother and child then headed off in the direction of the beach. He turned, but not before he caught a glimpse of the wooden telephone pole which still had remnants of one of the posters stapled to it by Ruth. 1 year, 344 days, 85 hours, and 56 minutes ago. Sometimes he thought they should have used that picture of Alice in the Red Queen costume she'd spent weeks constructing herself, that she was so proud of. In his old life, people were envious. Oh, you get to live near the beach. How wonderful. Of course they were envious, as he could be now when he saw families in the summertime. Crowds of them strolling along Sea Road, festooned with balloons and seagulls bombing to nick their flake 99s. They didn't deal with the realities of life lived near the beach. Shops emptied by holiday marauders, continual tailback, the annual caravan crammed into a castle archway that stopped traffic on either side. Washing the car 4 times a week to clean it of seagull shit that stuck like glue and corroded the paint. A garden full of feathers and chicken bones. A garden that didn't flourish because of sandy soil, and if a few stragglers managed to rise above it, they'd be ripped up by the roots in the gales of winter, which also filled the yard with rubbish from fallen bins. Oh, I do love to be beside the seaside. In a few weeks' time, Sea Road would be closed for the carnival parade, which every year passed his house. He would make sure he was not in the alcove then, watching the children, twirling batons, in costume on floats, dancing. Watching children was a pastime he'd once taken pleasure in. These days, you weren't allowed. If children were near you, the dumb thing was to look away, even if they made a horrible racket. But he had always looked, he told himself, with an artist's eye. That was before the black day the child he'd come to think of as his daughter went missing, the start of his girlfriend's separation from him, too. There had been no other topic of conversation Alice had found interest in once St. Elvins announced the theme of their Ffrynt carnival float, Alice in Wonderland. The Red Queen, Ruth said. Wouldn't you rather be Alice? I mean, with your name and all. How obvious, replied Alice, flipping her plaits. I've always fancied dressing like a queen, and I look fabulous in red. Alice's favorite subject was sewing. At school, she downloaded JPEGs of Tenniel's illustrations and worked out her own simple pattern on Ruth's laptop. The final version was created with layers of red gauze over black sateen, with tiny threads of gold shot through. After Ruth left, a few months after Alice's disappearance, Mallory started seeing Alice in the house. Always in the same place, always at the same time. If he woke up to use the toilet, the green glow of his alarm clock showed 1:47 a.m. In the hallway, he heard noises from the lounge. He could never stop himself from entering, from finding her, tall for a 12-year-old, folded into the child's beanbag they'd bought her one Christmas. Her skinny child legs stuck out under the glittery flounces of her hand-sewn costume. She always had the Etch-a-Sketch his mother gave her that same Christmas because she liked to draw, like her ersatz stepdad. Her golden head, with its shining plaits bent under the red crown with fake rubies from Wilko's, lost in the capture of dreams on the screen. As he approached, she would look up and smile, the loveliest of smiles, undimmed even by the braces on her teeth. She never said a word. He tried shutting the lounge door before he went to bed, but waking up, 1:47 a.m., to pad down the hall to the toilet, he could still hear the scratch of the stylus as it moved across the Etch-a-Sketch screen. The noise hurt his ears and remained in his head. Even after he went back to bed, it kept him awake. He ended up back at the lounge where he threw open the door. He also tried once to store the beanbag away. Until then, he'd left the lounge as it was on the last day he saw her. Shoved the beanbag into a box, taped the box up, and pushed it into a far corner of the loft. The Etch-a-Sketch was long gone, where he didn't know. The very next night he sat up in bed, wide awake. The green numbers told him it was 1:47 a.m. He padded down the hall, heard the squeak of the beanbag as her weight shifted it, the stylus too. Scratch, scratch, scratch. It was then that he stopped using electric lights, started rising at dawn and retiring when it got dark, even though he rarely slept through. Then he emptied the lounge of all its furniture, painted the walls black, ripped up the rugs, and moved the drawing board from the bedroom to the lounge alcove. He never saw her again. Not long after that, unable to do his stippling, with a need like breathing, the idea of the girls crept to him, possessed him. Tears scratched and burned at the skin of his lower eyelids. His heart swelled, felt as if it tried to stuff itself up his esophagus. He waited for the pain to pass, scrubbed at his eyes with the back of his hand. Careful not to spill the now cold coffee, he gently turned the girl over onto her back and began to cut through her waist. Sweat sprang out on his forehead. After a few minutes' struggle, he realized the knife needed sharpening. He dropped it on the floor and picked up the handsaw.